And so just to begin, I think it's really critically important that we start by acknowledging the traditional stewards of these medicines. Iboga is a plant medicine. It's a shrub that comes from Central Africa. It is part of a spiritual practice called Witi, where there are 55 different ethnic groups that are stewarding this medicine and working with this medicine. It has a long history of use within that part of the world and is seen as a cultural treasure by the government of Gabon and all the people in that region. So I just actually like to take a minute just to pause and give a moment of recognition to these traditional stewards whose medicine we're speaking about today. So with that in mind, I think it's really important to also acknowledge whose voices are represented here today. We are presenting findings back from a global international survey, from fieldwork in Gabon, and different voices. We also have videos today from Gabon, from the fieldwork we did in Gabon. And I will also mention that later in June, we'll be hosting a webinar in French, which is one of the main languages in Gabon. And we'll be having participants from Gabon come and engage with the report as well. So while we can't speak to everyone and in both languages today, it's really important to us that these findings get brought back to those communities who also spoke with us in their language. The reports are also available in English, French, and Spanish. So just for technical tips, if you want to put your Zoom on speaker view, we'll be pulling up some slides. The chat is there if you're having any technical difficulties. Kiko will assist. And then we'll walk through the first part of this presentation, and then we'll come to respondents and then a question and answer period. So turning it over to Ricard to start up the engine of our PowerPoint today.
Okay, I'm going to share the presentation. There we are. So yes, well, this is a two-phase project. It was actually the first time that we were involved in this. We had a very clear objective here, which was the one that afterwards became just the phase one objective, which was to engage with the global Iboga and ibogaine community, working together to enable positive change by identifying the community's strengths and assets and identifying a shared vision for the future. The point was that just when we started, we realized that the voices in Central Africa and Gabon were not going to be really shared or listened to, because there is different difficulties here, like the digital divide and also the linguistic barrier when we did all these focus groups, etc. So we then designed a second phase, which had an objective to create a powerful opportunity for African perspectives and voices to influence how Iboga and ibogaine are globalizing, bridging perspectives and strengthening intercultural connections between local African stakeholders and the global Iboga and ibogaine community. We initially wanted to go to other African countries where Witi tradition and Iboga is alive, like south of Cameroon and Equatorial Republic, but it was technically difficult at that time. So that's why we're gonna talk more about Gabon, where it's actually the central region where all the Iboga happens and Witi is developed, but still we take that in mind. So in order to do that, we developed a complex methodology, which was actually a mixed qualitative and quantitative methodology. Very briefly, what we did was we reviewed literature, great documents, etc. And then we did all this bunch of individual in-depth interviews. And we did all these different focus groups with clinical environments and also psychospiritual communities. And then we did this online survey, like a global survey in 4 languages. And we eventually discussed the results in different dialogue sessions with expert people in order to make sure that all the results were built up together with the community. So in total, for the phase 1, we interviewed 55 people from 12 countries, and we had 228 people surveyed from 34 countries. And then in Gabon, we could speak with 56 people from 13 communities. In total, almost 340 people, which included treatment providers, psychospiritual community people, vendors, distributors, policymakers, spiritual people, witty practitioners, government ministers in Gabon, and all kind of different activists, NGO directors, representatives, etc. So that's the frame of this work. Andrea, if you want.
Yes, please. And so Kiko, I think we'll put these links in the chat, but we have a landing page on our website. If you look at iseers.org/iboga-ibogaine, you can find an overview of this initiative and then these 3 reports. I was joking with Ricard recently when we finished the 3rd report that I think we've basically written a book, which was not necessarily our intention, but this is about, I don't know, 200 or 300 pages worth of information about Iboga and ibogaine that we gathered from the community. And so the reports are also available in English, French, and Spanish on our website. Next slide.
Well, it's actually 300, but most of it's in the phase 1 report, which is full of results if you want to check it out with all these charts and so on. And then the last one is the one that we're going to present today.
So the presentation today will be based on this final report, so you can read it yourself. And it's broken down into 3 sections. What we realized in the first 2 reports is that we didn't want to come forward with conclusions or recommendations until we had finished the fieldwork in Gabon, and were able to really step back and look at all of the information together. So there's a little overlap between these 3 sections, but we've basically broken down conclusions and recommendations into these 3 parts. So community, reciprocity, global healing, looking at biocultural regeneration sustainability, and then the 3rd is looking at the evolution of traditional and new healing approaches. So through the presentation, Ricard will show some videos, but Ricard will present conclusions and I will present the recommendations.
So in the field work that brought me with the team there to Gabon, we could speak with several people. Here we will see Tata Makonza. Tata Makonza is a spiritual father of the Komi community and the future king of the Buddhists, according to him. Yes, we didn't know the Witi had kings, but it's not the kind of king that we are used to. It's a king that can be refused by their community, by the other spiritual mothers and fathers. So he's still too young here to become a king, but he's in the process of getting and gaining wisdom, which it's very obvious that he's doing that. He speaks here of the power of Iboga and specifically of its power with respect to being able to abandon a dependency on anything, such as a drug. Let's see if this works.
Il vous éveille l'esprit. Il permet à ce que vraiment beaucoup de réflexes, beaucoup de sens se mettent en éveil. Beaucoup de sens. Il vous développe le sens de l'observation. Il vous développe le sens de la parole. Il vous développe dans le domaine où vous souhaiterez l'Iboga, qu'il puisse vous conduire, l'Iboga vous amène dans ce sens. C'est déjà dans la possibilité de vérifier avec l'Iboga s'il peut trouver une solution afin de libérer la personne de la toxicomanie. Si l'Iboga est aussi fort, a aussi cette possibilité de ramener la personne à de ne plus dépendre de la drogue. Quand c'est bien suivi, appliqué, c'est possible avec l'Iboga. Mais c'est un certain nombre de temps, un certain nombre d'années qu'il faudrait travailler avec l'Iboga et associer aussi d'autres plantes. Oui.
Yeah, well, Tata Ricardo here showed us also that they know also about what's happening in the world. So this brings us to this evidence that there is an invisible international network linking all the communities related to Iboga and ibogaine. We have been able to talk to all these different and to detect to all these different communities. Bwiti communities, which are themselves very diverse and rich. All these people from the international psycho-spiritual communities, all the Iboga and ibogaine medical subculture, and all these clinics. Also authorized healthcare professionals, which operate in countries such as New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil. Then supply chain actors, such as harvesters, cultivators, distributors, producers, investors, and also decision makers, policymakers, nonprofit organizations, researchers, and also not only humans in this community. We also take we give account to the Iboga plant itself, and also to the forests where all this biodiversity lives together with the Iboga. All these communities are all related, and but all seem to turn their back to each other sometimes, or at least to ignore that they exist. And what we see here is that the international community would benefit from enhanced networking, communication, and collaboration. And while mutual collaboration here could heavily increase sustainability efforts and foster greater opportunities for all. But to understand the current dysfunctionality of this connected global community, we need to understand a little bit more about the Iboga out of Africa story. So it's a familiar story, you know. It's this when the British and French go to Central Africa, we have this notion first mentioned in the beginning of the 19th century. Then in the second half of the 19th century, the first specimen is brought to Europe, to France. Then in 1901, there's the first ibogaine extracted. Then in 1939, the first medicine becoming drug in France for fatigue and depression. Then in the 50s, the research community gets interested. Then in 1962, Howard Lutzow finds out its powerful effects in treating addiction. And then that decade, there's these difficulties with legalization. And in the 70s, ibogaine, together with all these other plants, becomes a Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act. So we see how a cultural treasure becomes a drug. In 2021, just jumping to today, in this psychedelic renaissance framework where we are, industry and venture capitalists get fully interested in all the potential and economic assets of it, and Iboga and ibogaine now are seen as possible revenue sources rather than cultural treasures. We see, so this history points to a legacy of colonialism and post-colonialism that all these other plants have experienced. So the current global Iboga ecosystem is out of balance, and Iboga's connection to its root in Central Africa needs to be restored. But maybe it's the moment now to do things in a different way and to reconnect the disconnected tissues of our communities. So here we see Monsieur Jean-Moïse Muiro, Tata Makonza. He's a spiritual father from the Misoko Rite. And actually, he wants to give us a message to the international community.
Le message que nous donnions à la communauté internationale, du fait que l'existence et l'usage du bois sacré ont pour mission, je dis, l'existence de nos rites et l'usage du bois sacré ont pour mission de soulager les maux de l'humanité. Donc, le message que nous nous lançons, c'est que l'opinion internationale, que les organisations, que les ONG et l'État gabonais puissent aujourd'hui encadrer le Iboga. juridiquement, afin que nous soyons également bénéfiques, que nous soyons également mis dans leur fil conducteur pour au moins enfin bénéficier également des produits, des retombées de l'Iboga. Voilà un peu le message que nous lançons auprès de l'international.
Thank you. It's such a really honored to be able to share these voices. I think, you know, when I'm looking at the recommendations right now, I realize that some of what we're doing today is really trying to enact these recommendations. So bringing us back to those roots, I think is really important. So our recommendations based out of thinking around community in this global network is to really start thinking in a networked way, that everything is connected, that where the Iboga is coming from all the way to the production of ibogaine, clinical or spiritual practices within Gabon or outside of Gabon, that they all impact each other. So one of the things we definitely found is, as Ricard mentioned, is that there's a lot of disconnect in thinking about this as like an international network. The word community is a difficult one because there's so many different kinds of communities, but starting to think like an ecosystem, like a whole, is really critically important. And so we really feel that it's important to look at how to become more transparent, how to share more information, does it look like to have more equitable access to resources, and how do we support communities to self-organize? When things are scheduled substances, as we've seen with other substances, it pushes a lot of things underground in the international community, making it difficult to share knowledge and to speak. So policy reform is definitely a really key part of that network as well, and ensuring that policymakers understand and can help develop a fair and sustainable and equitable communication, but also sharing resources. The second recommendation we have is that, you know, looking at the clinical community is really thinking about what does collective responsibility look like. As we know, there's some health risks that can come from engaging in work with Iboga or ibogaine, and that these are much improved when people are sharing best practices. At ICEERS, we have a lot of experience working with different practitioner communities to talk about what does regulation look like from the bottom up. So rather than waiting for international governments to regulate these practices, really encouraging communities to speak amongst themselves and create spaces for acknowledging what kind of baseline practices could exist. And we'll get a little bit more into the clinical piece a little bit later. Also, you know, this piece around encouraging collaboration. You know, the people in Gabon that Ricard spoke with really want to have a say, that we know that there's a lot of research happening, that there's a lot of new evidence being generated. And so that the best way to generate really deep knowledge is to actually encourage collaboration. Unfortunately, there's currently a context of competition or an extractivism that doesn't actually help generate knowledge that will benefit everyone throughout the entire network. Another piece that in the phase 1 report, there's a whole section on the different discourses around Iboga, and it's really in ibogaine, it's really clear for us that we need to think about how we're speaking about this. You know, I live in Canada, where we're like the US, there's an overdose epidemic. And then what we see is ibogaine coming forward is like the miracle cure and this kind of rush towards it. And so thinking about what are the implications of some of these discourses and how are we making meaning? Can we shift also to more of a human rights approach, which says that people who use drug have the right to access stigma-free care, to treat their addictions, but also what does Indigenous rights look like within the context of a medicine that has such a rich history of traditional use? And as the video said, you know, this is a cultural treasure. What we'll probably repeat a few times is that the folks that Ricard spoke with in Gabon, you know, really saw that this is a treasure for the world, that we need to maintain connection to the spirit of the medicine, and that it can be shared, but they want to see acknowledgements of the roots and also benefits coming back. Which brings us to really the underpinning is this word that's becoming increasingly used in the psychedelic world that, you know, I think we need to tease apart quite a bit, which is like, what is reciprocity? And also what is reparations? You know, as Ricard laid out in the history, Iboga was first kind of brought out of Africa over 100 years ago. And there's been a lot of extracting of Iboga out of the continent of Africa. And so what does it look like to find reparations for what's happened in the past, but also in terms of looking forward, how do we embed this idea of reciprocity into all that we do? Seeing that reciprocity is it's not transactional, that it's really based on really benefit sharing. So we can look, and we'll speak a bit more about the Nagoya Protocol, and that fundamental to the concept of reciprocity, really, which is an indigenous principle, is right relationship. How to be in right relationship with the plants, with the land that they come from, with the stewards, and then also with each other. And so looking at everything we do is really thinking about how to develop these relationships and ensure equitable access and sharing back to communities that are the traditional stewards of these medicines. Back to you, Ricard.
Yes, well, here, Papa Ricardo, which comes together with Tata Makonza, he's a spiritual father of the Sika community, also from the Misoko rite, which is a very orthodox rite, which is right there. We can see in the middle the Sacred Mermaid that is a guardian of this Misoko temple, a very beautiful temple that we could visit. And well, Papa Ricardo speaks here about how Puiti communities harvest and cultivate Iboga in the wild.
La bonne manière, je vous dirais que, parce que si vous cultivez le Iboga et que vous ne replantez pas, mais vous tuez toute la plante, ce qui fait qu'on n'aura plus de Iboga. On n'aura plus de Iboga. Moi, quand je racine, je dis bon, tout de suite, déracinez, moi, j'ai aux enfants, enlevez-moi ce pied de Iboga parce que j'ai une cérémonie. Qu'est-ce qu'ils vont faire? Ils vont déraciner le Iboga, ils vont prendre les boutures pour le planter. Et le Iboga repousse. Les mêmes boutures, là, ils vont mettre quelques boutures. À la place d'avoir un pied, je peux avoir même 5-6 pieds qui vont repousser.
Yeah, well, Papa Ricardo here stresses the fact that the Puiti communities and spiritual people who go and harvest the plant, well, he's not saying this here, but they ask for permission. They have to ask to the plant why are they harvesting her and so on, and that they always replant lots of cutlings, so there are more always new plants than those harvested. And this is important because this is not the usual practice there. That's why what we see and what we've seen there is that in Central Africa, especially in Gabon, wild Iboga is being over-harvested, and this is impacting sustainability. We've seen important difficulties now to access the plant by the Puiti communities in some areas, especially in the urban areas. That's why in February 2019, the government of Gabon finally stopped all export from the public domain. So Iboga can only be exported now from private plantations, not from the public domain. But in practice, currently all legal export of Iboga from this country is officially prohibited until permits are delivered. So this brings us to a practical reflection, which is that mostly all Iboga and ibogaine used in clinical and psychospiritual settings out of Gabon, if they don't come from alternatives to Tabernacle Iboga, all of it is poached illegally from the forests, and most of it is not replanted. And this brings us to the second point, which is that sustainable Iboga cultivation is really happening in Gabon. We've seen that as well as in other African and non-African tropical countries, and it can provide benefits for local communities and ecosystems. There are several plantations ongoing in Gabon and in other countries, as we know, Cameroon, Ghana, Congo, Costa Rica, Mexico, Brazil. But actually what we've seen is two different models of plantations. There are this monoculture model where we see these well, I've witnessed like in the middle of the forest, this monoculture of almost 40,000 plants in North Gabon, which, yeah, they have some advantages because it's a traceable iboga. The final consumer will know where it comes from and so on, but it has great dangers to the forest sustainability of this biomass, which is the Central Africa forests, the second biggest in the world after the Amazon. Then we have this second model, which is an agroforestry model led by communities, more a fair trade approach, which is smaller, and there are some associations there like BOTF, others who are managing this now, but still in practical terms, we haven't seen the permits to export yet. So this brings us to the third point here, which is that how the government of Gabon proceeds in the short term with regard to the regulation of the cultivation and export of iboga will have an impact on the future of iboga, both locally and internationally and in the long term. The steps look to be right by the government until now. They are trying to implement the protocol of Nagoya, but the political situation in Gabon is very delicate and unstable. So strong lobbying is needed now to ensure that a fair market is created in Gabon and that all stakeholders are taken into account. But we need to be vigilant with what is happening in Gabon. And so that brings us to the fourth point here, which is that producing ibogaine from sources alternative to Tabernante iboga will for sure reduce pressure on wild plant populations in Gabon and Central Africa. We have several methods here to produce ibogaine from sources different to Tabernante iboga. Two of them, they are not working too much because they don't seem scalable, like synthetic ibogaine, which was developed in 1966, and some thought it should be the future of ibogaine production. And then also cell culture ibogaine, what we would say ibogaine hydrochloride. But also it's not sure if all of these can be scalable. So we have two options by now. Non-psychoactive synthetic ibogaine. This is like synthetic congeners of ibogaine, which would have the power against addictions, but still not psychoactive. We have noribogaine here, 18MC, Tabernantaloc, and some of them are in full development phase. So we should be seeing these in the market very soon. And then we have semi-synthetic ibogaine, primarily coming from Voacanga africana, another Apocynaceae plant, which has a little bit of ibogaine, but then it has other alkaloids which can be semi-synthesized into ibogaine, vocangine. And well, the point here is that it remains to be seen in what way all the patent system and all the patent culture and all this thing will allow ibogaine to be a common good that helps humanity, as the witty people say, or a private asset that enriches only a few and gets only to a few people. This is to be seen, and this is the big question here. So we have here Professor Blandine Akendenge. She's a professor at the University of Health Sciences in Libreville. And she talks about what she believes should be the relationship that should be established between the different parties that have made contributions throughout history to obtain products derived from iboga.
C'est que, à compter de maintenant, tout travail qui se fera sur l'iboga se fasse dans le cadre du protocole de Nagoya, où justement, où on recommande, où il y a la dimension à part, accès et participation. Ou pourquoi pas même des phytomédicaments, que nous puissions penser retourner vers ces personnes qui ont livré les informations sur l'Iboga et qui ont fourni leurs plantes parce qu'on dit qu'il y a des cliniques d'Iboga dans le monde entier.
Thank you, Ricard. I would say that, you know, when we began this project, we understood that there were sustainability issues around Iboga, and I feel like we've come away with a much more textured understanding of this. And I think, you know, what Ricard mentioned, the piece that's very clear is that we need to raise awareness around the biocultural sustainability issues of Iboga. As ibogaine is being heralded as a solution to global addiction issues, as we see in our phase 1 report, we really notice that there's also outside of the clinical approaches for using ibogaine, there's also an increase in psycho-spiritual use of iboga internationally. And so I think what's really important is to actually look at how we educate the international community to understand that, you know, the further we are away from a food, whether it's coconuts or even our clothing or a plant, you know, the further away, the less awareness there is about how that was actually derived from the earth. While we were doing the phase 1 and phase 2 reports, we found that in the international community, there's a lot of misinformation about where Iboga is coming from. A lot of people will ask the right questions. Is this sustainable? Where is it coming from? And people will say, oh, it's being grown sustainably. I have pictures from the plantation, or that it's sustainable from Cameroon. But we do know that a lot of Iboga being sold out of Cameroon is coming poached from Gabon. And so unfortunately, a lot of the information that's available is not correct. And so, you know, a strong recommendation, which is not an easy recommendation for us to make, is that until we can actually look at the supply chain so that there's more traceable Iboga for consumption on its own or for the production of ibogaine, that we really recommend that the international community really consider alternatives and really think about the impact that poaching is having within the forest ecosystems, within the access that the Bwiti people themselves have to Iboga from the wild. So one of the solutions really is to look at cultivation. Historically, Iboga is not a plant that's been cultivated. It was harvested wild from the forest. If you leave cuttings, it will regenerate. But the growing demand really requires that cultivation is a priority, and also cultivation that doesn't, you know, just clear cut the forest in order to cultivate Iboga. It's a plant that grows in the understory of the forest. So really a regenerative approach is preferable, or an agroforestry approach. But there's, you know, I think to pretend that Central Africa is not complex countries, that they're not complex countries to work in terms of bringing different resources or supporting cultivation. It is complex, but there's really a need to support the communities that are learning how to grow. These plants take, I think, on average, 5 or more years to be to produce Iboga that can be used. So the third recommendation we have, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Miriam and David, because I know you've been working on this, is how do we bring resources and funding to bring sustainable plantations and other biocultural conservation efforts. And when we say biocultural, we mean beyond the plants themselves, that there are traditions and cultures and histories and ways of using these, using Iboga, working with Iboga, that are important cultural histories and treasures and knowledges. So we're looking not just at sustainability for the plant, but also the cultures around them, for their own sake, not so that Westerners can go and extract knowledge and have this culture for ourselves, but really for the sake of people who are the traditional stewards, that cultural sustainability is essential. So there's really, as Ricard mentioned, there's some research that's happening into looking at alternatives, especially for the production of ibogaine. And so one of our recommendations is that this really needs to be a priority. In the first report we did, we asked treatment providers what kind of ibogaine they were using. About 20% indicated they were using ibogaine derived from Iboga africana, which was good, but that's still a small percentage, which means a lot is still coming from Tabernacle Iboga. And then this piece around looking at the role of policy, as mentioned earlier, we have a substance that is Schedule 1 in some countries. Here in Canada, it's on the prescription drug list, which requires ibogaine to have phase 3 clinical trials before it can be used. So the policy framework is incredibly important of how this plant can move through the world in a traceable way. And that also we need to continue to work and advocate within Gabon and support people advocating within Gabon to look at what does it mean to have sustainable cultivation, what does export look like, how do we ensure that the benefits return to local communities. Now move to the last section of our recommendations and conclusions. Back to Ricard.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. So here we have Mamadi. She's a spiritual mother of the Mombayano rite. Mamadi is going to share with us here a lamentation.
Non, moi je suis vraiment très désolée. Hein. Je suis très désolée parce que quand je vois les Blancs qui s'intéressent à la tradition, alors que les Gabonais eux-mêmes, ils foulent leur tradition. Puis ils parlent, ils disent n'importe quoi. Vraiment, c'est désolant. Désolant. Notre prière, c'est que Dieu ouvre les yeux, qu'il voit le bienfait. La religion chrétienne est née là, il n'y a pas longtemps, donc la tradition date de plus de 3500 ans. Donc, de la rédemption est venue bien après la tradition. Et pourquoi ils ne respectent pas leur tradition? Pourquoi? Et pourtant, il y en a, hein, là, il y a la plupart qui sont initiés, mais on ne sait pas ce qu'ils voient et ce qu'ils découvrent quand ils s'initient. Ils ne pas considérer. Ça. Donc, ça nous ferait très plaisir que les Gabonais s'imprègnent dans leur tradition, mieux que les Blancs, mieux que les Européens et les étrangers. Parce qu'il y a même les Africains qui sont intéressés, d'autres Africains qui sont intéressés, qui viennent ici. Mais les Gabonais, ils ne sont pas vraiment, ils ne sont pas imprégnés.
Well, Mamadi here laments how traditional spirituality has been attacked in Gabon by the Christian lore brought from abroad. Actually, she's saying that many people are initiated, but the point is that social stigma is so strong and Christian elite, let's say, they rule and so it's a strong attack against the tradition. So when she was seeing us very interested, she was like happy and sad at the same time. But the point here is that traditional medicine in Africa is yet strong, actually very strong. Within Gabon, this brings us to the first point, Iboga is part of a complex biocultural traditional medicine system that presents opportunities for improving healthcare for the local communities. And this knowledge could actually be applied internationally to improve mental health and addiction care systems. In Africa, a significant number of people, not only Bwiti practitioners from Gabon, but general population use traditional medicines and therapies from their traditions. They strongly believe, this was told many times to us, that Western medicine is good for the body and that traditional medicine is good for the spirit. Their conception of spirit integrates our very reduced conception of psychology. We'd say actually psyche is actually a Greek word, literally meaning spirit. It looks like we have forgotten in a way the profound meaning of spirit in our scientific approach of what it was called psychologia. We know that important research in mental health issues is needed urgently. So here, traditional ancestral knowledge offers an opportunity to move forward towards the integration of biocultural knowledge systems in service to a true revolution in mental health care. And this brings us to the second point, because there are other systems of knowledge that have also been developed such as the clinical therapies developed by the medical subculture. What we see is that clinical therapies with Iboga or ibogaine for problematic drug use are highly valued for their effectiveness and holistic care models. But standards of care vary widely, and risky practices must be addressed. In our survey, we saw that there were three things that people valued most about treatment centers: the effectiveness of the treatment, the lack of social stigma they experienced in dealing with the professional team, and the feeling of protection and accompaniment during the treatment. So this was very strong, and some others also, they were the most valued. But then we also see that even though many clinics are very strict and rigorous with all the tests that need to be done and the security for the health of their patients, some of them were even ignoring some of the things here. So we found many centers and clinics who, for instance, didn't develop electrocardiogram tests. So they didn't, it looked like they didn't know about the heart dimension and problematic that can be linked when having flood doses. Many of them didn't develop blood tests or urine tests, so they didn't know if the people there were having other substances at the same time or not, or they had them in their blood. Many of them were not aware of if they were taking or had stopped taking benzodiazepines or alcohol, which could be implicated in some problems when we take high doses of Iboga or ibogaine. And also, very importantly, although many of them are very strong with it, many don't touch the psycho-spiritual dimension. So they don't prepare people for this experience that they're going to have, and they don't have integration sessions afterwards where people can give a meaning to the huge spiritual and psycho-spiritual experience that they have. And last but not least, here we see that increased availability of pharmaceutical grade ibogaine for clinical use could expand access, which is very good, but it comes with some risks that should be considered. So yeah, there is a strong need to find solutions to the challenges of the global crisis of addiction and mental health. And so Iboga and ibogaine therapies show great promise, and they come with great opportunities for investors, opportunities for governments who could see reduced their expenditure in health related to addictions and mental health, opportunity for those in need of the medicine all over the world, and opportunities for local communities in Africa, which could benefit from a fair trade, and also for researchers and for science in general. It's full of great opportunity. But there are some concerns and risks. All the production processes and derived knowledge initially developed within traditional communities and Western medical subcultures could be patented, concentrating benefits or all benefits, we don't know, in the hands of a few people, some of them newcomers to this scenario. Also, it could have a strong negative impact, all this system, on the traditional witch communities. And last but not least, the medicine could only be reached by those who could afford it and not by those who would really need it. So that brings us to present our last invited guest here from Gabon, which is Monsieur Aristide Nguema. He has a long experience as a psychotherapist in France, where he was working with Iboga before it was banned in 2007. And now he's currently the executive director of Blessings of the Forest Gabon. Mr. Nguema speaks here of the framework of cultural knowledge in which the Iboga action is situated.
Alors, je vais essayer d'être court et d'indiquer que ce n'est pas l'Iboga qui a été l'objectif de mon imprégnation. C'est plutôt une tradition culturelle au Gabon, qui est basée sur un rite de passage. Et ce rite de passage meilleur pour sa société, meilleur pour sa famille, meilleur pour son peuple. Donc, c'est d'abord la démarche culturelle, avant d'être la démarche liée à l'Iboga. L'Iboga fait partie du tout là-dedans. À l'origine, c'est ça.
Non, moi, je...
Ricard. These are our final set of recommendations before we go to listen to a few respondents, and then we'll move to a Q&A session. So as Ricard spoke to, there's really a need for improved standards of practice and care in international clinical environments. We want to recommend that there's really better availability and accessibility of sustainable quality ibogaine, particularly in these clinical uses. It's really important to know what's in the medicine that's being used, that there's room for improvement, to learn from practitioners who've got many years of training, to actually share best practices, wise practices. And also there's a lot of incorporation of non-professional staff within this framework of clinical work, which is really important. So the inclusion of peers, so example, people who have experience of addiction or of ibogaine, really integrated into those teams. And also looking at integration, this is a very profound experience for people, and that there really needs to be adequate preparation and integration that also address psycho and spiritual approaches. And in the report, there's several more micro recommendations within that of what that could look like. There's really an importance of recognizing in a policy framework way within different nations, and also at the international level, that traditional, complementary, and alternative medicine, which is the term used internationally, is incredibly important to recognize. That a lot of traditional communities around the world, not just in Gabon, that traditional medicine is a critical importance of healthcare and community care. And so there's something really amazing here that could actually be pollinated outside of more traditional communities that we could learn from in the West, of what it really looks like to have a community care model. And that this is really a critical and important component of looking at mental health and addictions care, which are not doing so well in the West. And I think in some ways that's probably why there's such a great interest in Iboga, ayahuasca, psilocybin, other medicines, is that they're really needing a new way to approach mental health care, but that it's, as the last video spoke to, it's a whole approach. We can't just extract small components. I think when Ricard came back from Gabon, one of the pieces that I think about often that I think is really critical is that when he asked people like, what's your ideal future for Iboga? And he would get a strange look, because Iboga is part of such a system of care that to actually just extract it and talk only about Iboga just doesn't actually make sense. And I think when we want to counter extractivist ways of thinking around Iboga, this is really somewhere to go back to. How is it involved in a system of care, but also how are we all involved in an ecosystem internationally that all impacts each other? And so this really points to the fact that there's an important need to bridge more modern science with traditional wisdom and ancient sciences, and thinking about how do we actually create a new form of knowledge that's not based on competition, that's based on sharing, really with the goal of bridging two worlds, Western science, traditional knowledge, and bringing the benefits back. I think an important key message is, you might have followed through the thread of these videos, is that there is an interest in Gabon amongst Bwiti practitioners to share this knowledge, this treasure, with the rest of the world, and that there's really an openness to doing that if the spirit of the plant is respected, if the spirit of Iboga is respected, and that traditional knowledges are respected, which would also help bring more legitimacy and respect for Bwiti within these countries. and that, you know, benefit sharing through the Nagoya Protocol and other mechanisms is increasingly important, and also the supporting science that should happen within these communities, and also bringing some of these benefits back. So that's the end of our conclusions and recommendations. A few more slides here.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Well, here just it's impossible to thank all the people involved here. Some of the people who we talked to in the focus groups, in all these different settings, some of them are here now, we know that, and we're so happy about that. And all these names, like almost 400 names that we couldn't thank, but this is a collective work, and we're just trying to put these voices here to work as a starting point to start a debate from now on. And well, we have also special people who were very involved in the phase 1 and phase 2, which you can see here. Also, well, thank to all the ICES team, and thank you today to Kiko, who's behind the screens here, making all of this possible.
Yeah, I was reflecting last week on what a gift it is to be trusted with people's stories, and that there's, you know, as we saw, over 340 people who shared their perspectives with us. We hope that we've done justice in presenting it in this way in the different reports and in these conclusions and recommendations. Yeah, we see this as a beginning, as a starting point for really thinking about how do we actually move forward on these. So I'd also love to also especially thank two people who are here today, Miriam Balat and David Bronner, who is through their collaboration, their support on multiple levels, including funding, that we were able to do this. And they've been working really hard also on biocultural sustainability issues around other plant medicines, specifically peyote. So I wanted to invite them today, and we'll also invite Ben DeLonen to just offer some reflections on, you know, diving into this a little bit deeper from your perspectives, to hear what you thought about the recommendations, where you think we could go next. And then following these 3 respondents, we'll open to questions and answer, which we will invite you to do by raising your hand.